Well, today we will work with Edward I and Edward II and the rise of the Parliament during those reigns. Edward I became king after his father's death, King Henry III, in the year 1272, and he was King of England from 1272 until 1307. He was known as the English Justician because he made some important contributions as regards law and justice in England. He was considered primarily English, and there wasn't an English king since the years of the Anglo-Saxons. So, as I told before, Edward I gave two important things to England, and they were the statute law and the conquest of Wales. He was called a justician because he strongly believed in justice and in the law, and he thought that the kings must reign under the law or through the law. He was the first king, the first English king that had the idea of a united kingdom. That's why he decided to invade Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. During his reign, the English monarchy remained strong, but the Parliament was rising in those times. There were some legal reforms during Edward I's reign. The most important one was the statute law. It was his most important contribution to England as regards justice and law. By the statute law, the legislation passed by the king in the parliament, so we can say that there was a new type of law. Why? Because the parliament must accept the laws. It was a consent between the parliament and the king. This was called the statute law, and it is still applied nowadays, not just in England or Britain, but also in the United States. Since those times, there was an expansion of the legal professionals. There were judges and lawyers, and they were considered professionals. The Curious Regis was now divided in three parts. There were the Court of Exchequer, the Court of Common Pleas, and the Court of the King's Bench. It was first applied in the reign of Henry III, but Edward spread that kind of courts. So we can say that by the statute law, the king was the figure of justice. He governed, but he did it under the law. He respected the rules of the law. As regards the church, during Edward's reign, the Church of Rome had a friendly relationship with the English crown. There were friendly terms between them. But Edward didn't want to do the same things as his father did with the church. You can remember that during Henry III reign, the church was very important and the Pope had all the power in England. Henry III had to pay a lot of money and different kinds of taxes to the Pope. That's why this king, Edward I, in order to avoid those mistakes, applied the Statute of Mortmain. What was that about? It was a limit to the extension of the church property without royal consent. So the church couldn't have many lands without the royal consent, of course. Lands and properties. Then he also added a tax to the clergymen, and it was because of the Crusades. England spent a lot of money because of the Crusades. So King Edward decided to impose that tax to the clergy. Of course, after that appliement, the Pope claimed that that taxation could take place just with papal consent, just if the Pope approved that kind of taxation. So Edward made two important contributions to England. One of them was the appliement of the statute law, and another one was the conquest of Wales. Edward was the first king that had the idea of a united kingdom. He wanted to join England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland under the same monarchy. He wanted to rule all the countries. That's why he conquered Wales. King Edward fought against different revolts that were in Wales against the invasion. After that, of course, he won and he succeeded as King of Wales. Wales became part of the English kingdom. What happened to the King of Wales? He was King Loworth. After King Loworth's death, his son, Edward, was designated as Prince of Wales. That's why, nowadays, the title of Prince of Wales belonged to the eldest son of Great Britain's monarch. Nowadays, the Prince of Wales is Prince Charles, because he is the eldest son of the Queen Elizabeth II. But it wasn't so easy to conquer Scotland. Scotland wanted to be independent from England. So there were several revolts and battles between Scottish people and the English army. Scotland was divided in different groups. Let's say that its population was composed by different groups, as the Picts, the Angles, the Scots, and the Britons. If we think about the different invasions that there were in England, we know that the Celts and the natives from England escaped or moved to Scotland. That's why there were several groups in Scotland's population. The land was divided in the lowlands and the highlands. In the lowlands, there was a Norman influence, and in the highlands, the most important group were the Celts. The Celtic influence was strong in the highlands. What was the excuse that Edward used to invade Scotland? Edward had proposed a king for Scotland, but the Scottish people didn't accept that king as candidate for the crown. That's why he deposed the Scottish king and he invaded Scotland. Thanks to that, the Scottish revolt took place in the year 1297. Who was its leader? The famous William Wallace. William Wallace was the leader of the Scottish resistance against the English invasion. At first, Wallace defeated the English army, and thanks to that, he invaded northern England. So we can say that in the Scottish story against England, in those times, Scotland had two heroes. The first one was William Wallace, that he defeated the English army. And the second one was Robert Bruce. Robert Bruce was crowned as the Scottish king without the English consent. Of course, England disagreed with that. That's why some years later, the next king of England, Edward II, who was Edward I's son, he tried to defeat Robert Bruce, but he failed. And it was the worst defeat of the English army. One of the problems that England suffered during its history was that strong and important kings were followed by unable kings. And this is an example. Edward II was unable to rule. He was frivolous and weak, and he was like his grandfather, Henry III, because he depended on favorites. There were some people, advisors, knights, that influenced him. One of them was the Knight of Gascony. His name was Piers Gaveston. The Parliament disagreed with that kind of relationship that the king had with the Knight of Gascony. That's why he was banished. But the king didn't accept the banishment, and he continued giving him the royal favor. So at the end, the Parliament decided to execute Gaveston. Edward had problems with the barons and the Parliament, thanks to the influence of his advisors. That's why in the year 1322 a civil war broke up in England. There were baronial disunity, heavy taxes, and also there were successful raids made by the Scots that tried to invade northern England again. So, the causes of the Civil War were the baronial disunity, the taxes, and the successful raids made by the Scots. There were two important people that were against the king, and they were Queen Isabella, his wife, and Roger Mortimer. Queen Isabella was negotiating peace with her brother. She was the sister of the King of France, and she fell in love with Roger Mortimer. Roger Mortimer was from Wales. So both of them made a plot against King Edward II. In 1326, Isabella and Roger won the battle. But finally, in 1327, the Parliament disposed Edward II in favor of his son, Edward, Duke of Aquitaine. So we know now that Edward II was replaced by his son Edward III. We are going to continue working in this topic after the midterm exam.